is Savannah Cummings. I am from Columbia FFA, and today I am doing an OH demonstration under the production category. Today I am talking to you about grades and standards. In Florida, there are four grades of nursery plants. They are Florida Fancy, Florida Number 1, Florida Number 2, and Cull. Is there a standardized way for producers to grade the plants and can determine where they'll be put in a landscape or if they'll be put into a landscape at all? The different grades and standards are very important to production because they can determine the pricing of a plant as well. Because if you sell something for a high price and it doesn't do well in its future home, customers aren't going to want to come back to that nursery. So it's very important that these are used in today's nursery settings. So to start talking about these plants, I'm going to show you about azaleas specifically today. They are type G or Globose grading standards, and I'm going to show you what makes the grades the grades. So starting with this first one here, it's really dense in terms of foliage. It's nice and full. If you were to split it down the middle, the sides are pretty even. If you look, the canes or stems aren't overly hardened. They still bend, but they're not squishy or soggy or anything either, which means that this plant isn't overly mature for its size, but it's also not too underdeveloped either. The plant's leaves are all mostly the same color and size and shape. This is good for photosynthesis because the plant needs those leaves to soak in the sun and respirate so that way it can produce its own nutrients. If you look at the base, it's not too thick. There's not too many canes coming off of the base. The plant's really dense. There's no mechanical damage or pest damage anywhere on this plant. So this plant I would call Florida Fancy, which is our first grade. It'll do well in just about any landscape that you put it in. Now, if we look at this next plant, as you can see, starting off, it's a little bit taller than our Florida Fancy. Not quite as dense, still pretty dense though. The foliage is mostly all the same color except for some of the new growth is a bit of a brighter green, which is normal. The canes aren't too overly hardened for its age. They're still not soggy either. Since it's not as dense though, it is going to be harder to keep in check, and when it gets moved into its new home, it's going to grow a little bit taller naturally, but that can be done with a little bit of corrective pruning. So this one will do well in a landscape, but not quite as well as a Florida Fancy, so I'm going to call this one a Florida Number 1. For this next plant, as you can see, it's not nearly as dense as our first two. There's a lot of spacing and gapping between the canes. The leaves are various different colors. We have some red leaves over here. There's a couple of yellow leaves throughout. The canes are a little bit harder than they should be, so this plant is a little bit too mature for its size. If you look, it does have some splitting of the cambium down here, which is where it got pruned incorrectly and got collared, which means that the bark got cut off along with the stem, and that leaves this plant open to parasites and bacteria that can get inside and kill this plant. So this plant is going to be a Florida Number 2. It'll still do very well in a landscape, but not as well as the other two. You're going to have to stay on top of keeping this plant fertilized and pruned so it can thrive in its new home. And lastly, we have Cull. Usually these ones are not put in landscapes by any professional because if they aren't already dead, they're usually pretty close to it. No one can safely put this in a landscape and say that it will thrive. So for this one, as you can see, it's very, very uneven. If you were to split this down the middle, it has one branch on this entire side. It has a lot of flowers on it and is very hardened in terms of the stem. It's not very bendy at all, which means that this plant is overly mature. If you look, the plant's leaves are tons of different colors. from where it's in various stages of dying and other things. There's a ton of chlorosis on this plant, which is a lack of chlorophyll in the leaves, and that's going to make sure that it has trouble taking in the nutrients that it needs. And when a plant can't get its proper nutrients, it does die. So if you were to put this in a landscape, it wouldn't take to it very well at all and wouldn't survive, in all honesty. So to go through them again, we have the Florida Fancy, Florida number 1, Florida number 2, and Cull. The first two are going to be what you most commonly see in nurseries in Florida. These are the ones that are going to take best to a new landscape and thrive in their new homes. Florida number 2, while still very good, is going to be less commonly used. It does well, but not quite as well. This is going to be the option for people on really tight budgets, but they still want plants in their yard. They're lower quality, so they are going to be cheaper, but they're very nice overall still. And then Cull, no one really uses these. They're not good for a landscape. If anything, you'll ultimately end up infecting other plants in your yard and downgrading them because of the problems that these ones can carry. Grades and standards are very important for producers because that takes away from everything that the plant has and how well they do overall. Well, I hope that me talking a little bit to you about grades and standards today does inform you a little bit more about how producers use these to improve their businesses and practices within Florida. Thank you for your time and have a good day.